Ladies and gentlemen, Victor Louis. Hi.
Good morning.
I want to start out by asking about the fact I understand you have some issues with the actual title of our discussion.
Yes, building the first American group is what I think you've titled us, and we try not to focus on nationality. In every single piece of communication that I've done, I've referred to us as the first New York-based house of modern luxury brands, which really just speaks to the fact that we're headquartered in New York, we're traded on the New York Stock Exchange, so that's our home. But we're not driven by any nationality. Our brands today, the three that we have, Coach, Stuart Weitzman, and Kate Spade, happen to be New York-founded brands, happen to be American brands. But our team is global, our consumers global, and I hope that in the future we evolve to have global brands that are not necessarily American brands as well, maybe even one or two out of the European continent.
So what does it mean then? I mean, to be a New York-based group, besides being traded on on that exchange, like how do you define your point of difference?
I think there's a view of luxury that's quite different than perhaps the traditional European view, and I would say that there are a few places where we differentiate. First and foremost, I just think we're more inclusive. Our view of luxury is one that is more approachable, that speaks to not only the fact from a price point perspective, but I think from a customer experience perspective, from the breadth of our product offerings, but just as importantly from the culture of our teams. We are truly global, and I think that we aspire, whether not based on nationality, not based on gender, not based on sexual orientation or how one identifies him or herself. And I think there's an opportunity today for a house of brands that offers talent, whether that be creative or business talent, the opportunity to find a home where they can find comfort for themselves.
Okay, I'm going to call you an American luxury group just for the sake of efficiency and like less verbosity. But this has been an idea that has been talked about a lot over the last 10 years, and various different businesses have kind of flirted with creating a group of brands based out of the US. No one has really done it. So how come you think you can?
Well, we have done it, so I think we're beyond can to achieving it, and now obviously there's a lot more work to do than what we have done. In terms of the past, very hard to understand why there hasn't been necessarily success to date. I think there are several tensions out of an American view, or let's call it a New York-based view relative to a European view. From a group perspective, the first and most important difference, of course, is the capital structure. And by that, of course, we mean the ownership structure. European groups tend to have a majority shareholder, the largest and most successful. That just provides, from some perspectives, of course, a different worldview in terms of how they look at the concept of time. If you are a family holding assets and your number one objective is to hold those assets and hand them to your children, you have a different concept of time. If you happen to be a New York publicly traded institution, and that's not to say that all American companies are publicly traded, there are a few in our space that are private, but if you happen to be so, you're dealing with a few concepts that are almost mutually exclusive. Building brands, which can take years and decades, and dealing with the New York Stock Exchange and an investor base that is often looking at results on a 3-month basis.
But the European brands are publicly traded. The European groups are publicly traded.
I think they're publicly traded in nature. But I do think, or at least officially, but I do think that underlying that, if you have a shareholder that has a 50 or 60% controlling stake, I don't know that their responsibility to the shareholder outside of themselves is the same. And I don't think the level of transparency is the same. If you look at what it means to be traded on New York Stock Exchange as a retailer, the level of transparency, I think, is at a very, very high level relative to some other capital markets.
I mean, talking about comparisons, which are odious, but we're going to make them anyway.
Sure.
When apologies to the LVMH and Kering people who are in the room, but we're just going to go there. Those groups tend to report their results sort of en masse. So actually it is quite hard to know what each brand is doing, and that has its advantages. This is not something I understand you're going to do. You're actually going to break out each company?
Yeah, well, it comes again to there are SEC regulations, and I think it speaks to the difference in the transparency of the respective exchanges, and then the actual governance practices of those markets, and then what we're required to do. From an SEC regulatory perspective, we have to create business segments that reflect how we manage the business. We manage the business as brands. We don't manage it as one glob. And so whether it's Coach, whether it's Kate Spade and Stuart Weitzman, will be reported as individual brands. Now, in the future, if we have 10, 15 brands, and we break them into, let's say, a luxury fashion group versus, for the sake of conversation, a fragrance and cosmetics division, you can then report that way rather than report as 15 or 20. But given the numbers that we have today, we will report as individual brands.
So when you became CEO of Coach, was this always your plan that you were going to, that you saw the opportunity to create a kind of group of brands and to take Coach and build on it?
Sure. I think any of us who have the aspiration to lead, we role play. We sit there and we watch what our CEO is doing, and I think through my own experience, I had seen a lot of opportunity for first and foremost the Coach brand to evolve, but also for our corporate business model to evolve. Again, dealing with the reality of being a publicly traded institution, which is what I inherited, at the end of the day, I was forced to think about what do I need to do for sustainable long-term growth and earnings? How do we manage effectively as a publicly traded institution? And the first and foremost, there was what any individual brand needs to do, which is constant innovation. So we needed to evolve the Coach brand. And that was the only thing I inherited at the time. And then we got to thinking about, well, how do I leverage this asset and create around it a structure that is more diverse, whether that be geography, product category, and of course the most important diversification one can have is brand, because anytime you have one single brand and you think about unlimited growth, 10 to 12, 15% a year forever, you're eventually going to try and become everything to everybody.
Or
by definition, you become nothing to everybody. So that need for diversity was important in our strategy. And then underlying that was the third part. We call this our corporate transformation, but it was first to transform the Coach brand. Secondly, to transform the company from single brand to multi-brand. And then thirdly, to transform our culture and our most important capital asset other than our brands, our people, to ensure that we could manage in this new business model.
And how did you convince the shareholders it was a good idea?
Well, you have to take them on a journey. I think that you have to, in some ways, through the communication of your strategy, also partially move your shareholder base. We made a few decisions relative to our strategy, which we communicated effectively. We told them there was a 3 to 5 year strategy to execute it. And then the most important thing that one needs to do is then actually execute against it and ensure that the results measure against what you have communicated. In so doing, you eventually build credibility, and in doing that, of course, you will engage with your investors in a way and build your investor base in a very different way than you had in the past.
Now, Stuart Weitzman was your first purchase.
Correct.
Why that one, and how many other companies had you looked at?
Well, we have a process where we meet as a board, so we have an independent board of directors. We're 99% publicly traded, and we have a process where we have quarterly board meetings. At those board meetings, from the very first one that I had, I broke the meeting into 2 halves. The first half was the Coach brand. The second half I used to call Coach Inc. So it would be Coach brand, Coach Inc. When we were talking about Coach Inc. in the corporate strategy, we were very much talking about the growth of the company through acquisition. And we had a filter by which we looked at various potential targets. Some did not consider themselves targets, of course, and many still don't.
You want to tell me which ones?
It's not something we would share publicly. But
Start with the B?
There's a lot of rumors out there. I wouldn't comment on rumors, but there's a lot of targets that we look at, and then you end up engaging in conversations with the board and creating, if you will, not only a list of targets, but an ideal timing. And that timing almost never works out. So then you have to open up yourselves to opportunity. And as things either become available through action on their side or through the encouragement of conversations on our side, you're able to then engage more fully in the potential of a merger or an acquisition or some action taking place.
I mean, when I think of Stuart Weitzman and Kate Spade, I do think of two very American brands whose profile is largely U.S.-centric.
That is correct.
You know, and Coach to a certain extent, you know, the same. So how do you get from that space, which really does look, I think, externally like an American group, into an international player?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because initially, in fact, I can say that we had one or two discussions, not the one that you mentioned, with European companies that didn't work out. And initially, we thought the first step, it would be good to actually think about a European company just to break the mold. It didn't work out, and then we began to think about, obviously, the next piece, which was focusing on specific brands, specific categories, where then our ability to be successful would be highest. And it, of course, as an American-based, New York-based company, acquiring and integrating other New York-based companies is easier. Culturally, of course, most importantly, because a lot of acquisitions fail because of cultures not coming together, the inability to create synergies, or just the inability for managements to have a shared worldview. And so I think that now we're proving ourselves to have at least the ability to do it on the American continent, and specifically from our New York base with other brands there. Yet to be proven if we can be successful on this side of the world or perhaps in Asia, but that's in the future.
And how much sharing actually does go on between the three brands? How much is separate? How much is cross-border?
Sure. On the front end of the business, very, very little. Each brand has its own CEO, its own merchant, its own design team. They operate very, very independently. On the back end of the business, from a sharing of talent, sharing of best practices, sharing of sometimes supply chain systems, we're putting in place a complete new operating system for the company, if you will, a foundation of IS systems to support growth and to support easier integration go forward. That is shared across the three brands, but that would be it.
Manufacturing, factories?
In certain cases, not all.
And how much kind of know-how or sharing of best practices goes on?
I would say quite regular, again, at a brand president level, we sit together, or at a marketing level, they may share. For example, we do have on the digital side a chief digital officer who will share best know-how, best practices across whether it's everything from search marketing to obviously social media to engaging in the actual e-commerce platform itself. We'll also have some shared practices across media buying. So there's know-how, but there's nothing forced upon a brand. At the end of the day, each brand CEO, each creative director is driving the right decision for the brand. The key is that. The key at the end of the day for our success is not going to come through the synergies. It's going to come from the brands having their own individual relationships with their customers, and that is what we prioritize.
What about from a real estate perspective?
A lot of sharing. A lot of sharing. I think that is one of the most important areas for leverage. We know that that's not always very transparent on the front side of things, but whether it be across shopping malls, freestanding locations globally, we have a lot of established relationships. Those relationships, of course, allow us to introduce the brands to other opportunities. I think that's especially true globally. While we're an American group, if you will, at approximately $6 billion, almost 35–40% of our business is international. So especially strong in Asia, growing here in Europe now quite quickly. And so we do have increasingly a very global footprint that allows us to help those brands to develop into global brands, and real estate plays a very important part of that.
I mean, this is still a relatively new experience for you, right? It's been, what, 3 years?
3 years.
3 years. So what mistakes have you made?
Oh my goodness. I knew you would have one or two difficult questions. We were joking just before I came up here that I do quite a few of these, and I can always depend on Vanessa to ask the difficult questions. Mistakes. I think talent is always one that we look at. It's the most difficult thing that we do, putting the right people into the right place. I think speed. You can always go faster, and I believe that one of the things that's always challenging is you try to take and we discussed earlier, whether it's your investors, whether it's your team, whether it's your board on a journey, and sometimes not moving fast enough can be opportunity cost. And so I would say around talent, and I can point to many specific examples that I won't but I think that talent is always talent is always key.
But you can also move too fast. I mean, we heard yesterday from Alexander Gillick from Paddle 8 that he, in a kind of quest to expand quickly, he made a wrong decision. How do you balance that?
Well, I think...
And it's expensive.
You would need to go into specifics. So, for example, in the case of Europe, from a real estate perspective, we probably moved a little bit too fast from a geographic perspective. The easy mistake that many companies make, ours is no different, is one can look at Europe and think of Europe as a country. It's not. It's a lot of different countries, a lot of different cities, a lot of different languages, and I think that we spread our team a little bit too thin very early on. One can look back and say that was a mistake. We could have focused much more on first and foremost, 3 or 4 cities rather than countries even, and from there created a base for growth. So there's little things like that, but I think learning, understanding that it's a mistake, accepting that it's a mistake very quickly will allow you to not only, of course, establish a foundation of learning, but to build upon that as you grow.
Okay, I have one more question, and then we're going to open this to the floor.
Sure.
And it's a question I know everyone in the audience is probably wondering, which is, how much money do you have to spend, and what do you want to buy?
Well, we're not very leveraged. Again, as a very public company, anyone in the room can look at our balance sheet and see that we're in a very good place. In terms of what we would want to buy, we're very close to our space. I think what we offer through Tapestry now and Tapestry really exists as only a corporate brand, is an opportunity to attract great talent, an opportunity to create a brand that our shareholders believe in, and then an opportunity to create a brand that other brands, and whether they be in Europe, again in Asia, or other brands in the US, may find value in being a part of what we offer. And what the company offers is a platform, if you will, for individual creatives to be able to express themselves with a certain amount of freedom without, I think, having a father brand or mother brand like Coach Inc. was on top of Kate Spade or on top of Stuart Weitzman with an overhang, and the resources to allow for international growth. We've proven that we have the capacity to do that with the 3 brands that we have, and we look forward to bringing other brands into the platform that we can help grow globally.
Do you have an ideal number? Like 5 would be good, or 10?
I am very realistic in the understanding that I have a certain amount of time. I'm a caretaker for a period of time, and so whether that's another 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years will be determined, of course, between myself and our board of directors. Within that period of time, I wouldn't say there's a specific number, and of course, what happens after me, I think the opportunity is truly boundless. I don't think we should put a limit on it.
Okay, no limits. Questions? Oh, we'll go here first, then Stephen.
Just a very quick question, Victor. You talked about acquisition. You talked about a series of filters for acquisition. What are those filters for Tapestry when you're looking to acquire a business?
Sure. I think first and foremost it would be around product category. There are very few categories that we believe we have the capacity today to add value. And then, of course, from a geographic perspective, whether we can provide support in helping that asset grow. We have to add value. And that value is going to come through one of 3 things. It's either capital, an actual growth capital. It's either a certain know-how that we have, that may be a supply chain. We know how to make a handbag pretty well. We're learning how to work in footwear. We're learning how to work in the ready-to-wear space and establish truly owned product development and production capacity that can do so at scale. That's very important for us because we are a very large group, and so if we're going to actually impact growth, we have to do something at scale. And then I would say it's the international growth piece, continuing to develop a talented group of international leaders that can help brands develop globally. Traditionally, American companies have been specialty retailers. Retail is a very local game. They approach the world like merchants, right? If you look at retailers, there are very few that do well across the world. European brands have been great storytellers and family-controlled groups that have done a great job telling their story globally. I believe there's a talent model where we can blend these 2 things with a blend of analytics and great merchandising with great creative talent and great storytellers to bring a more approachable, more inclusive view of luxury to the world. If we can offer that to a brand or to a talented creative, and that's what they're looking for, a home where they want to be able to do that, then we're the right place for them. If not, then we're not the right place for them.
Okay, Stephen?
Could you give us some idea of the principles you put in play to resolve the internal differences of view between e-commerce and stores in achieving some sort of integrated customer experience?
Yes. I don't know if they're principles. I can tell you that there's a lot of tension always between e-commerce and, of course, the stores. But one of the most important principles is the amount of transparency, of course, that the web brings and how much promotional activity you're doing online. One of the first decisions we made before I became CEO, we had grown our e-commerce business very dramatically. This is public information, so I'll share it quickly. And it's the same thing, same part of the strategies that we're implementing today with Kate Spade, which we only acquired this past July. The view that anything e-commerce is good, given what is happening today around us, right, in the world of Amazon, I think forces a lot of brands to make a lot of very quick decisions, especially in how quickly they grow online through promotional activity. And I believe that the level of transparency of the web eventually will have a knock-on impact, of course, on the brand, what happens to teams and stores who don't feel good and are competing against this. So in the case of Coach brand, for example, within a 2-year period, we grew from 0 to $500 million online. Of that, a vast majority was done through the flash sales model. It was the time of vente privée. It was the time of guilt. That was where all the valuations were going, right? Multi-billion. And so we used a lot of that know-how. We grew our business very quickly. One of the first decisions I made was to knock that down we took away $300 million overnight. Just closed. We went from 3 events a week to 1 event basically a month almost. And by doing that, we were able to get a lot more commitment from our sales teams, right, in stores, who began to feel better only because they felt like we were protecting the brand, which at the end of the day just gave them a different time horizon for their careers, how good they felt, and how they felt about us as a leadership team in terms of what we believed in for the future. I think the key principles would be promotion. I think in terms of giving your sales associates credit for any online sales, the omni-channel worldview of a customer being able to return in store, pick up in store. If it's going to be truly transparent, then the human beings involved in the process have to have a stake in the game. So I think that that's absolutely vital if you're going to have an omni-channel, true omni-channel experience. And it's the same thing even with the call center. We actually also now incentivize our call center to do the same, whether they're taking a return or cross-selling, giving them full credit on the sales.
Thank you. Okay, one final question.
Thank you. I like the idea of seeing the American companies like retail-driven and the European one as brand-driven. And I have a question for you. In building this New York-based international fashion brand, is there any group building or group growth that you are benchmarking against or simply looking at as an inspiration or something not to do?
No,
or do differently?
Not necessarily. I think we're going to have to create our own story and build our own story. And I think you used some of the language that we use internally. I do look at these values as continuums. If you have retail on one end and brand on the other, we're going to probably lean towards being more brand-driven, more consumer-driven, whereas in the past we may have been more retail-driven. I think if you look at exclusivity, country of origin, high prices, versus inclusivity, we're going to lean towards being more inclusive from a culture perspective, from an approachability perspective. I think if you look at just a worldview which is based much more on the belief of transparency and optimism, and that is professionally managed. Part of being so transparently New York publicly traded institution is that we're professional managers. So the belief that anyone can come into the company, one day potentially be CEO, and fulfill his or her dreams. If we can build a luxury group that has great brand assets and that is attractive to talent, that is interested in pursuing those dreams, then I think we have a shot at sustainable long-term growth. And that's what we're looking to build.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Louis.
Vanessa.